Hello, my name is Eric Cooperstein. I'm a private attorney in Minneapolis. I have a solo practice devoted to representing lawyers in ethics matters, both defense of discipline complaints and advice on legal issues. Minnesota Lawyers Mutual has asked me to give you a couple of tips about what I think are the most difficult trust account issues for lawyers, the place where lawyers tend to get themselves in trouble with their trust accounts. And I would say, for the most part, there's really just two areas. Most people know that your jurisdiction has rules about what types of trust account records you have to keep and the way you have to keep them. But what I've seen in my work with lawyers is that one thing that lawyers fail to do is they don't maintain the client's subsidiary ledgers. They may call it something different in your jurisdiction, but nearly every jurisdiction is going to tell you that in addition to keeping a checkbook register, which is very similar to your personal checkbook register, in addition to keeping a checkbook register and to checking the bank statements each month, you're supposed to keep a separate list for each client of the transactions that occurred on behalf of that client. Like a checkbook register, it has a running balance. It includes the name of the client. It includes the date, the check number, the amount of the check, and the purpose of the check. But unlike a check register, which mixes together all different client matters, your client's subsidiary ledger sets out what happened just for that particular client. And you maintain that ledger until the client's matter is done and either their trust account funds are expended or the balance of the funds is returned to them. It's a very important tool for reconciling your trust account. Sometimes lawyers make mistakes because they work off their memory or they look at their checkbook register to figure out whether or not they have funds in their trust account to pay out to a client or to a third party. And in fact, they've forgotten some little piece, some money that was supposed to belong to another client because they haven't looked at the client's subsidiary ledger. So that's one mistake lawyers make regarding their trust accounts. The second mistake is very closely related to the first, and that's the way in which you reconcile your trust account each month. If you're using a bookkeeper, for example, I've talked to many lawyers' bookkeepers, and I'll ask them, are you reconciling the trust account? And they say, oh yes, we reconcile the trust account every week because we go right online and we look at what checks have cleared and we check them off on their check register. Well, that's the type of reconciliation you might do for an ordinary business account or for your personal account. But for a trust account, the reconciliation process is a little bit different. It's essentially what I call it's a three-legged stool. There are three pieces to a trust account reconciliation. Two of those pieces I've already mentioned, right? The checkbook register and the bank statements. You have to look at the bank statements each month, see which checks have cleared and which checks haven't cleared. If there were late deposits at the end of the previous month, they may be in your checkbook register, but they may not have appeared on the bank statement. You need to reconcile the IOLTA interest, which is credited to your account. You didn't know about that before the bank statement came. So you have to do that work at least once a month. But the other very important piece is to take all those client subsidiary ledgers that I just mentioned a moment ago. You have one for every client, plus you probably have a separate ledger for the IOLTA interest that gets credited to the account and taken out on a monthly basis. Take all of those ledgers, you take the balance at the end of the month from each of those client ledgers, and you add those up. That's your client subsidiary ledger trial balance. And the number you get at the end of that ledger, of all those different client amounts, has to be compared to the checkbook register and to the amount on the bank statement. All three of those pieces have to be reconciled before your trust account is truly reconciled. And the reason for that is you could make little mistakes in your checkbook register. You could transpose digits, you could allocate something to the wrong client, and you wouldn't necessarily find out that you had made a mistake simply by looking at the checking account statements. You need to look at the client subsidiary ledgers to see whether or not there's money in the account on behalf of that particular client. It's also a part of that process, part of the process of figuring out what checks haven't cleared, comparing the bank statements to the checkbook register, is to look at the uncashed checks. Uncashed checks can tell you a lot about what's going on in your practice. One time I looked at an attorney's trust account books and records, and we went back through all the uncleared checks. And there was a series of uncleared checks in sequence from 3753 to 3758. And we all thought, well, that's odd. Those checks hadn't cleared in over a year. I said, well, I'll bet those checks were never sent out to the client. I bet they're sitting in the file. And sure enough, they went and they looked in their file, and there were the checks. They were all there. They had been issued. They had been cut. They had been signed, but they never went out to the client. Had that law firm been doing proper reconciliations and looking at their uncleared checks, they would have noticed that those checks hadn't cleared and followed up on that problem. There are sometimes other problems. There are times when clients haven't received their money. There may be times when third parties haven't received the money that you were supposed to pay to them on behalf of the client. Checks do occasionally get lost. Sometimes a client will be upset or angry about a matter. They haven't cashed your check because there's something that they're not happy about. It's your responsibility as the attorney to go back and figure out why those checks are still not cashed, follow up with the clients, and make sure those matters are taken care of. So always remember, keep your client subsidiary ledgers on a daily basis, just like you do your checkbook register, and make sure that each month you reconcile checkbook register, your client subsidiary ledgers, and your bank account statements. If you do that, you should be able to avoid most trust account problems. Thank you very much.